Hi everyone. On today's episode, we are covering anger. How to unpack anger. What do we do with all of this anger? So I wanted to do this episode because it's just such a powerful topic and all of us are affected by it, I think, in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes we're the ones who are struggling with anger. Sometimes it's somebody around us. And it'll still impact us. So with this episode, we're going to go through what do we do in that moment. And I have two goals for you. And the first goal is, if you are new to this, unpacking anger, how do we do this in a good and safe way? And then the second goal is, how do we do it in the moment when somebody else is upset or we're triggered by somebody else? But you have to go through the first goal first, okay? So that's what I'm hoping for. In this first goal, we're going to figure out what do we do if we're kind of new to processing anger and we've never tried, we maybe are kind of explosive, everybody in our family is explosive, and so how do we change that? And you know what? You're in the perfect space for that. We're going to learn. And I want to have a disclaimer, first of all, that I'm definitely not judging anybody. You know, I have gone through this myself. I spent a great deal of time in my 20s learning how to unpack anger, and it still took a while. It took a while to get to a place where I feel that it doesn't really rule my life at all anymore. You know, I feel very, very calm and peaceful almost all of the time. But that being said, it does not, I still get triggered. I still have my moments, but it's just not as destructive to others or to myself. And so that's what I want for you. And so I know I've spent that time, I've done the work, and you can too. You know, there's hope. Even if you feel it's been a long time, there's no way you could change, of course you can. I 100% believe in the power of transformation, that we set a goal for ourselves and we can achieve it, and we can do amazing things in this world. So it's possible for you, and that's what I'm hoping for you. And by the same token, if you want to share this episode with somebody who you think maybe they've mentioned it to you, that they're struggling with their anger, they would like to do things differently, they've seen the destructive side of anger, share this with them. Maybe it'll help them, and maybe they'll, start doing that work, and, you'll really see some change. So, like I said, in my 20s, I definitely struggled with a lot of anger, and I had spent some time in therapy, and I read a book by a Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, I think was the one. He wrote a book on anger, and I was kind of desperate. I wanted anything but to feel angry, and I was like, how do you get rid of this? Read this book, and he really spoke about how anger is like a seed inside of us. And what we normally think is, oh, this person made me angry or whatever, then often there's actually anger deep inside of us, and these things that are quote unquote making us angry are actually triggers. So these triggers are tapping into that reservoir of anger that we have deep inside. And then that sounds really scary, like we're just walking around carrying all this anger, but we really are, truthfully. And until you get to the bottom of that and you start dismantling that and unpacking it, and I'll probably say unpacking a lot on this podcast, because it's just such a core part of yoga, and yoga in the sense of how I live my life with yoga, not just asana on a mat, but unpacking that anger is going to be the core. It's going to be what helps us to overcome and, find our way to peace. So, that being said, easier said than done, right? But it is possible. So I really like that thought, though. It really helped me when I read that to understand that, maybe I had larger issues at play that were, sitting inside, festering, and, and then these, somebody cuts you off in traffic and you're like, "Wah!" And you lose your mind. Suddenly you're just enraged. And sometimes it doesn't match the situation, but your anger is so large. And now suddenly, if you do anything in that moment, then suddenly you're going to have drama. You're going to have chaos, crisis, problems. So how do we handle this in a good way when that happens? And how do we get to the root of our anger? So what I say, and this is for goal 1, okay? Because goal 1 is, and this is what I would tell, because I was a former principal, this is what I would tell my staff, especially when we would talk, because we were doing some trauma training, and it was really important to me that they understood what to do when they were feeling triggered or they saw somebody triggered, right? But especially for themselves when they are triggered. Because that's going to happen even if you're a teacher, that you're going to have moments where somebody has crossed the line and you're upset. Now you're mad. And then often what would happen is it would become a power struggle in that moment with my staff and, let's say, a student or even another staff member. And somebody was being disrespectful, I'm offended, and now suddenly it's like you need to stop and correct yourself in this moment, but that's not what I want for you. Okay, so the very first goal for you, and I want you to think about what we learned as children from fire safety, from firefighters and whatnot, and in the midst of a fire, we're taught to stop, drop, and roll, right? And so you know that drill. I want you to think about the same thing, but a little bit differently. I want you to stop, I want you to breathe, and I want you to remove yourself, okay? So, and it can even go in the other direction. You can go stop, remove, breathe, whichever you prefer. But in any case, I want you to remove yourself from that situation because you're in a heightened state. And if you've never done this work, you are going to probably create more drama. So what I would tell my staff was that, anything you say or do in anger, you will regret. 100% you will regret anything, because at that point, it's your ego that's moving into protective zone and it wants to protect you at all costs. And so, now you have created this bubble of other, right? Like them versus me or me versus them. And you'll stop at nothing to, make sure that they don't hurt you or they get it back in, some kind of revenge, retaliation. So we're going to stop all that drama. First and foremost, we're going to recognize, and so you're going to have to go through those body cues. And I want you to stop and think right now, when you're mad, what does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that sound like? What's going on inside of your body, inside of your head? And there's a lot of physiological cues. So you can think of, maybe my fists get tense, or my jaw gets tensed, or, my breathing starts becoming more rapid. It's going to look a little bit different for everybody. So I want you to get in touch with what it looks like inside of you, okay? Because that's going to be your first clue. And so now you understand, I'm mad as heck, and I want to strike back. But you're not going to, right? You're going to remove yourself, because that's part of it. We're going to stop, remove ourselves, and we're going to breathe. Because breathing is naturally calming. We're going to calm ourselves through breathing. And so that's the first step, all right? And then the next thing that we want to do is we're going to start to unpack it. We're going to unpack our anger. And so we're going to get to the root of it after we've calmed down, because you won't be able to do it when you're angry. Like I said, once anger is such a large emotion that it blocks your logic, right? So as soon as you're mad, all the logic goes out the window. And so what we want to do is we want to, stop, breathe, calm ourselves, allow that logic to come back. And some sometimes, like with trauma training, people will suggest that, if you name it and you say, I am angry, then sometimes your logic starts to flow back in, right? Because once you name an emotion, it kind of calms it because you're acknowledging it. So now we're alone, and now we are trying to unpack our anger. Okay, so how can we unpack it? Well, there's a few things you could try. Something that I do, of course, as a yogi, I will meditate. And maybe it's not at this moment, you're out in public. I'm not going to just sit and drop and, meditate or something like that. But maybe I'll remove myself and I'll get myself to a place where I can make it possible. And, we went through meditation that first video. You don't have to, sit cross-legged in Padmasana. You could sit on a bench and you can just meditation again. It's bringing yourself inwards. So we're going to start exploring what's going on inside of us, right? So you could meditate, you could journal, and this is something that I did in my earlier days prior to meditating. I would take out a pen and I would start writing, and actually I do this fun lesson with kids, and I call it magic journals, and that's the whole point of that exercise, is you get them writing on a piece of paper, and it can start wherever you are. It can be F this, F that, I can't stand this person, blah, blah, blah. And then you just keep writing, and you'll start processing that emotion. And then what used to happen for me is that I would get to a point where I could feel that I was calmer, and I could see with my writing that logic had started to enter, and actually my creativity would enter. And I would start to see, okay, what can I do in this situation? And I would talk myself into a solution. So just, watching that transformation happen on paper is kind of incredible. You go back and, maybe it's 7 pages of rage, and you start at the beginning and you go, oh my gosh, I was mad. I was almost ripping that paper. And then by the end, you're going, okay, hey, wait a minute. I think I know what I need to do in this situation. So that's another solution that you could try. Something else that you could also try is going on the Y train. Okay, and this is something that Jay Shetty has mentioned it either on his podcast or maybe in one of his books. And there is I think it is also a Buddhist monk who talks about the Y train. So you're starting to ask yourself, why am I mad? And, and it can be something like, well, they cut me off in traffic. Well, why does that make me mad? Well, it's not right. It's unfair, and then, well, why does that matter? And you keep asking why until you exhaust all the whys. And sometimes you can be up to 7 whys. I think that's the recommended amount, was ask yourself 7 whys or something like that. And I think when you keep asking yourself, why does that make me mad? Why did that make me mad? Why did that make me mad? Then you start to really get to the root of it. And of course, when you start to really understand the root of it, then you can address that, right? And hopefully, that you can give yourself some grace and some compassion, because it happens so instantaneously, but at the end of it, there's something going on deep inside of us. And if you're familiar with Marshall Rosenberg and his nonviolent communication, I listened to this audiobook, I'm not even gonna lie, I bet you probably 50 to 100 times. I had it on repeat in my 20s and my 30s. I still listen to this because I learned so much from it every single time. And in this book, he really talks about how, our emotions, they're expressing a need that's deep inside of us. And we have very basic needs, and they're common in everybody. And that even speaks to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that. Educators will be for sure. And how we have, very primal needs. And they can be a need for justice, a need for safety, a need for autonomy. And so, when you explore that Y train, you're going through all of the thoughts that will lead you right to your core need. And so then when you start to understand that need, then it's easier for you to express yourself, maybe to that person, go back to that situation and address what went wrong that triggered you so badly. So those are some ways that you can unpack your anger, right? But it's really important to understand and acknowledge that emotion, right? And not judge yourself and not judge others, because I know sometimes as educators we have these, what is it called? It's where we have the different colors for the kids, and it's the, I'm in the blue zone, I'm in the green zone, I'm in the red zone, and that helps kids to understand what zone they're, zones of regulation, that's what it is. Okay, so the zones of regulation. And that's a system to classify the emotions so that kids will understand where they're at and give themselves that grace, right? And understand that, when we're in the red zone, maybe we're not safe to be around people. Exactly like what we said, stop, breathe, remove. Same thing for kids. And so acknowledging that emotion is going to help us, but I really like to remove all judgment from those emotions. Emotions are simply, messengers for us to help us understand what's going on, and it's our reaction and our response to the world. It's our reaction and response to people around us, to events, to things that have happened, and that is what helps us to be sentient beings, that helps us to, add that color and connection to our world. So I don't want you to think that, anger is a bad emotion, I shouldn't feel angry, love is like the best emotion and I should always be loving, and great if you are. I'm happy for you. But the reality is that we have, just an immense amount of emotions, and we need to understand them. So that's the point. It's just acknowledge it and remove the judgment. Don't call yourself a bad person for being angry. Don't call somebody else a bad person for being angry. That's a human emotion. We are all granted emotions, and particularly to men. I really think, that a lot of men suppress a lot of their emotions because, we're taught in society that they need to be, stoic and manly and all of these things. And so there's a lot of bottling of emotions. And then we have these crazy suicide rates for men all over the world. And I always said, when I was a principal and I had boys in my office, and sometimes they'd even be with their dad and they'd be crying about something, and I could see the man, the dad or the uncle or somebody, kind of tensing up because, sometimes they can be really uncomfortable with expressing emotions. And I would always say to boys, you know what? Creator gave you emotions the same as a girl. That doesn't make you, less of a man. It means that you're human. Acknowledge that emotion and feel that emotion. There is nothing wrong with feeling that emotion. And so I really want that message to get out to all our men and boys out there that, there's nothing wrong with crying. There's nothing wrong with feeling sad or feeling, blue about anything. Like, you're a human, and give yourself permission to feel those emotions. You're allowed to feel them. Doesn't make you less of a man, okay? I want you to understand that one. That's really important. And then often, like I said, there'd be a young man in there, and there'd be his dad or his uncle, and then the dad or the uncle's like, yeah. I don't know if they had a conversation later and, in the car on the way home. I don't know. I hope not. But I hope the dad heard it too, or the uncle heard it too, and gave themselves permission to feel that emotion also. So we're acknowledging the emotion. Something else, and of course, remember, this is goal one. We're still alone. We're still by ourselves. We're unpacking that emotion, acknowledging that, emotion. And now, we need to express the need. We've unpacked it. We've got to the core of it. We understand why I was really upset in that moment now, because sometimes we don't know why. We're just mad, and we always say, it's the other person. No, something's going on inside of us that touched us. So now, how do we express this? How do we let the other party know this? And you can write to them. I recommend sometimes, if you don't trust yourself, that you express it in a letter. You write it out. I definitely wrote a lot of letters in the beginning. And eventually you're going to get to, how do I express this with talking, right? Because I always say, even for expressing, writing is the first step. And then the second step, and that can be texting, Texting is fine too, because you're getting, or emailing, or, some written form of communication. Then the second part is, how do we have that conversation? And you're in great luck, because this is my specialty area. This is what I'm doing my dissertation on. I'm going to do a conflict series very soon, and we're going to learn how to have difficult conversations. And how do we do that with grace and love and compassion to build a relationship and not sever them? That's coming soon. But for now, you just need to know that you do need to get that out to somebody, and hopefully not dramatically, right? Hopefully you're going to try your best to be able to bring this information to that person in a good way. All right, so now it's really important that you learn how to release this pent-up aggression now, because you snapped, you were upset, and there's a body response to that. And so as a yoga teacher, I would often tell people in my classes that our body remembers everything. It remembers every time we've ever been angry. I remember one time, when I started my yoga journey, I was doing certain stretches, and then I just burst out crying, and I didn't know it was this deep need to cry and just let it out. And sometimes back bends will do that to you, because you're really activating that nervous system. But even deep in your muscle tissue, that sometimes emotions get stored in there. And if it's in our muscles, sometimes it's in our organs, right? And sometimes it creates sickness inside of us. If we leave this emotion just lingering all over, then we have, maybe heart disease, high blood pressure, we have a risk of strokes and depression, because sometimes people are so afraid to express any kind of anger to somebody else that they turn it on themselves, and that can become depression. So we want to be able to, release this energy, because it's energy, right? A big emotion has a lot of energy, and we want to get it out. We don't want it trapped in our body. So some things that you could do to release it are some kind of physical activity. And I always say, okay, because sometimes rage rooms are a really big thing right now, and let's go into this room and let's smash everything, and I feel so good after it. And I'm yes, I can see that. But the problem is, if you're not unpacking your emotions, you're not understanding what is going on, you're kind of skipping some steps, and you're just going to this release, and you're not doing anything to actually get rid of it. You're just releasing a bit of the energy. You're not releasing that anger. So I say, okay, you really need to unpack whatever's going on in there. You need to understand it. And also, I think if you think of yoga, we have to be really cautious and mindful of how we spend our energy. And so sometimes, if we're in this rage room, and I don't know, maybe it's going to go in my comment section, people are going to say, oh, it's the best thing, it cured me from everything, and that's great if that happens. But sometimes it cultivates this energy of, okay, this is great, and, screaming into a pillow, and, but I think that when you allow yourself to kind of experience the crazy, that sometimes the crazy gets bigger. And so that's my fear for you, right? So, if you're trying to be mindful, and the anger has served its purpose, let's get it out. Let's do something to get your body moving. I think that really often helps, some kind of physical activity, yoga. There's also, if you are able to access this somewhere. Maybe I'll do a session on this later down the road, but there's something called Yoga Nidra. I'm a Hatha yogi, and so it's part of our, yogi system, that towards the end we have this Yoga Nidra embedded in the relaxation section. But sometimes it's just, in and of itself, it's a separate kind of class you can take somewhere. You can maybe find it online, and it really helps you to tense up your emotions and then release them and soften them. And then the activation of these muscles, tensing and relaxing, sometimes that can release a lot of this pent up energy that's inside of our body. So that's something that you could try. If you're not going to go for a run or go swimming or run up a hill, you could try yoga nidra. Something else you could try is, like, if you're creative, try something creative to get it out. For me, I'm also a painter, and I draw and I write. So sometimes, depending on my mood, I'll, tap into that, those emotions and kind of just get them out. And there's something really therapeutic about that creative process. Whatever your creativity is, or wherever your creativity lies, there's therapy in that, and so you're channeling all of those emotions into something, into some kind of product, and it's the process that's really the therapeutic part, right? It's not just the end goal of, I made this painting. It's like going through the motions and with focused intent and energy. And so, those are some options that you could try to learn how to release that emotion. That's really helpful. Something else to consider next would be, how can we reframe this situation? So when we're thinking about, the anger, like I said, oftentimes we will look at somebody as the source of our anger. This person made me angry. This person did this and that, and it's all their fault. But if we're not going to reflect on it, sometimes we won't grow, we won't learn, we won't figure out how to do it better in the future. So I really need you to sit and ask yourself, is there something that I can learn from that episode? What was my role in that situation? How did I maybe exacerbate or make that situation worse with my anger? Now, hopefully you didn't do anything once the anger was there, you removed yourself, but the lead up to that, there was something that happened that led up to that, and maybe it was some kind of power struggle, maybe some words were exchanged. What happened in that moment that helped you, or pushed you, I guess, to really feel angry? And so understanding your role, how can we learn from this? And we have to be able to say, when we're wrong, we screwed up. You know what? Because it's a really key part of growth as a human to own it when you screw up. And then, of course, with owning that, there's also, the reparation part of, maybe an apology is in order. Maybe you crossed somebody's boundaries. Maybe you offended them. Maybe you didn't intend to offend them, but they got offended and now we had a situation. So understanding your role, that's a really key one. So, now that we've kind of unpacked it, processed the anger, what can we learn from it? But also, is there some forgiveness that's needed for ourselves? Do we need to forgive ourselves for this situation, something that we said or did? Forgiving the other person? Is there somebody that needs forgiveness in this situation? That's part of that processing, that emotion and reframing that situation. That's going to help us in the future, especially to build that relationship. I really am a big believer that we should try our best to, build relationships with people, because, we're flawed humans, but so are they too. And so how can we grow together and be better together? Something else to consider is letting it go. Right? So now, we have processed the anger, we have released the emotion and the energy behind it. Now maybe is the time to distract ourselves. Maybe now is the time that we put on a funny movie. Maybe now is the time where we go with our best friend to a movie, or we do something super fun, and there's nothing wrong with distracting yourself if you have gone through this process. I think sometimes what happens with people is they immediately go to distraction. Like, let's say they remove themselves, go to distraction, Nothing happened with that anger. It just sat there. And that's where we have that root, that ball of anger, that just, maybe it's that seed of anger that's growing into a big, gnarly bush inside of us. So if we're not going through the work of processing it, sometimes it can get out of hand. And so we're going to distract ourselves after we've done the work, okay? So make sure that you're, giving yourself that time and that focused energy to go through the steps. All right. So now that is basically goal number one. That is unpacking your anger. That is helping us to grow as a human. So that is goal number one. And that's a lot, and if you're new to this, and you have to go back and check the steps, that's fine. You know what? It's a manual. It will help you. And I hope it helps you, right? I really hope it helps you. But now, let's say you start to get comfortable with this. You start to get good at this process. How do we... Wait, I had an example first that I wanted to talk about. So because I said I was a principal and I had some trauma training with my staff. And so I remember the first year I was at this school, we began with trauma training, and I had a whole group of people, and they kind of went through the steps, and we learned, what to do when you're triggered or kids are triggered and that kind of thing. But now it was the next year 2, and I got some new staff, and they had not done any of this training, and here was me, constantly saying we're trauma-informed school, we're doing trauma-informed practices, but this person had no clue, never done any trauma training, and I could see there was a situation, and this person got triggered by a kid, and and I had to pull them into my office, and I had to say, hey, you know what, I need you to understand, when you're upset, this is what we do. We remove ourselves. And this person said, well, they disrespected me. And I said, yeah. And I said, I'm not, negating any of that. I'm not condoning this behavior from the student. I'm simply saying that that's not the moment to address it. When we go through all those steps that we went through earlier, there's that expressing part. And that's where we would come in and we would, have that conversation with that person and say, your behavior was unacceptable, you were disrespectful, and that's where you bring in the rules. When everybody's calmed down, you've started to unpack your emotions, and that's where we do it. We don't do it in that moment. And that was a really key thing that I expressed to my staff often, that, we are not doing it in the moment of anger. We're just going to make things worse. We're just going to aggravate people. And then suddenly, now we're going to have a situation and there's going to be a fight breaking out and that sort of thing. So there's a time and a place to address the behaviors that, happened in that moment, but it's not when you're angry. So anyway, I was going through this situation with this person, and and they were like, wow, okay. I think they were a little bit upset that they were kind of called out on their behavior and their role, because they really felt it was an injustice in that moment. And it was. I think, teenagers, they cross the line. They're teenagers. And I was not excusing that kid's behavior, but simply, when you're an adult, there's a higher level of expectation for your behaviors, right? Because you're a role model. And so, I was trying to work with this person, and then they left my office. And then now, I'm going to say it was about a week later, suddenly I had a kid that was very upset. And this time they were like a little bit upset. There was a situation, they came into my office, they were upset, and the staff member had been in my office also. And in that moment, I was a little bit rattled, right? Like the thing, I don't know, maybe I had too much caffeine that day, maybe I didn't have enough sleep, but I was provoked, and I was a little bit upset, and and I was upset with this kid, and suddenly the kid stopped and says to me, "Why are you staring at me like that?" And how come you're, and just kind of like alluded to the fact that, what I was doing was aggravating them. And in that moment, I had to stop myself, and I was like, okay, I'm the adult in this moment, and I have to also, I can stare down at this kid, but I'm also going to aggravate him. I'm going to piss him off. And, and so I had to, remind myself, like, what is my goal in this situation? And so in this moment, I had to actively, mindfully break my eye contact with this person and look away, because I knew I was triggering them and I was making the situation worse. And it was hard as heck to do because, when we get angry, like I said, that logic leaves the room and suddenly we have to go bigger and crazier and we have to win, and that's all ego driven. And the staff member, remember, this is a staff member that I had just recently talked to about, being provoked and that sort of thing. And then they connected with that kid right then and there. And they said some soothing things. They were listening. They were validating. They were, really with that kid. And here was me being blah, a little bit rattled and having to coach myself in that moment. But just goes to show that, when we're really mindful and we pay attention to that stuff, the difference that it makes in that situation. And he really soothed that person, that kid at that moment. And I had to have a conversation with him later. And I said, you know what, you did an excellent job. And in that moment, I was the one who was triggered, and I was the one who had to coach myself. And so, I was real grateful that this person really heard me, and I saw a difference in their behavior, and it was a hard shift for that person. They admitted to me later, because we had more situations and more triggered kids, and usually I'm very calm and steady and that kind of thing, but I'm human. And it still happens with me, and I'm still going through that process with everybody else. So I hope you start that process, and I hope it helps you. So now I wanted to talk about goal number 2. Once you go through this process and you start to get really good at it, how do we respond in the moment? Not removing ourselves, right? How do we do this in a loving and compassionate way? And it's possible, right? Sometimes you might be like, oh, my anger is too big. I need to just remove myself, and that's fine. Honor yourself where you're at. If that's where you're at, go and take a breather, and start that process of unpacking what's going on inside of you, and let's dismantle that anger. But if you're able to stay calm in that moment, in the tension of it all, and not react with anger, then that is the goal. That's goal number 2. So in goal number 2, I want you to consider react versus respond. Okay? So reacting is where exactly when I had that moment with that teenager and he said to me, why are you looking at me like that? And gunning me off. Now I had to switch my brains, right? Because I knew, and anger is often an automatic reaction. It is a primal way for us to tap into some information that's deep inside of us. But sometimes what happens when we're reacting, keep in mind that that's, it can be driven by your ego. And so your ego, like I said, it wants to protect you. It wants to strike back. It wants to keep you safe and it others, right? It creates this distance between the other person and ourselves. And that's our, primal animal instinct. But we want to raise our consciousness to a higher level. So in that moment, we're going to move towards responding. Okay, and that's what I did actively in that moment when that kid was looking at me. It's like, oh, wow, I got to get out of my reaction brain and I got to get to my respond brain. And I did that pretty quickly, right? I chose to look away. And then and luckily there was some support in that room, this newbie who was just like an excellent student and knew what to do. But I had to coach myself and switch into responding brain. And responding means this is where I'm going to activate my love, my compassion, my patience, my tolerance, my forgiveness, all of the divine virtues that I want my soul to embody and to express in this world. Sometimes I have to switch into that and I have to actively make that choice. And so I'm in this large moment and I can react, right, from my primal animalistic self, or I can move over here to my responding self. And I can say, okay, you know what? I need to bring love into this moment. I need to bring a bridge. I need to be the bridge. I need to create this connection. How can I respond to this person in my most loving way, my most compassionate way, my most patient way, right? And then for me, of course, I have a, very strong relationship with Creator. I nurture it every single day as often as humanly possible. And so that's usually where I go right to my guidance from Creator. Creator, how can I be more patient in this moment? How can I be more loving in this moment? How can I listen without my ego getting in the way? How do I get there? Help me in this moment. And you know what? Usually that grace is granted to me. And suddenly, and I've switched, because there's that automatic humility that comes when you invite a spiritual presence, to help you and to assist you. And if you're not spiritual, or you're not, maybe you don't believe in God or Creator, you can still activate these values. You can still, just remind yourself, how can I be more patient? How can I be more loving in this moment? For me, it's very easy, because I feel like, Creator taps in and helps me, and I just become that vessel, and I express, myself through, all the virtues that really matter to me, the values that really matter to me, and I can become more loving in that moment, and less Jess, who's a mess, and more like Creator, which is my goal always is. So there you have it, people. You have goal number 1, how do we unpack the anger? And goal number 2, in the moment, how do we react versus respond, and the choices that we need to make in that moment, which are 100% possible. So that was a really important episode for me, because like I said, I've seen this happen a lot, and I know, oh gosh, anger is such a big emotion, but it has a lot to tell us, and I don't want you to ever, like I said, I don't want you to think it's a bad thing, because it's not a bad thing, but it's when you act in your anger, when you flip off the finger and start swearing, now we're gonna have some drama. So it's really important that we unpack that anger before it destroys us. That's really key to all of this. So thank you for listening. I hope you got something out of it. If you have other ideas that you think are wonderful, and you want to share them on what you do in that moment when you're angry to unpack it or dismantle it, share that with us. Share it in the comment section, because we can all learn how to do this and be better at it. And so that's my hope for all of you. So thank you so much. And check back next time. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you so much, and see you next time. Bye.